My name is Greg Wiebe. I work here in the academic office as the executive coordinator for the Office of the Vice President Academic. But I'm also a scholar, and I just want to give you a sense this morning for why I'm excited about these lectures. I was first introduced to Professor Robin Jensen as a PhD student at McMaster University in about 2009 or 10, when she was invited to give a lecture and make other related appearances. A professor of mine, Peter Whitcomb, who, as it happens, has also delivered the J.J. Thiessen lectures, had invited her to our class. In preparation for her visit, we read her book, Face to Face, which is a very fine text that looks at the early history of Christian art in terms of the relationship between art and theology, taking into account conflicts over idolatry and iconography, and with consideration of how the Christological controversies so formative for the church in the first millennium affected the portrayals of Christ. It was only subsequent to this, however, when I finally began somewhat belatedly to self-identify as a patristics scholar, that I began to realize what a big deal Professor Jensen really was. For those who don't know, patristics is the scholarly study of the fathers of the church, and indeed the formative period of Christianity from the birth of the church to about the 7th century. When I finally admitted that this was the appropriate home for my scholarship, I started trying regularly to attend the annual meetings for the North American Patristic Society. Yes, that's right, NAPS. There's some pressure to change it, but I don't think so. Now, Professor Jensen served as the president of the Patristic Society in 2013 and 14, which is certainly a big deal. But that's not really what I mean. I quickly realized that this was a very active scholar, consistently presenting more than once every time the society gathered, and frequently at high-profile plenary-level gatherings to large rooms full of people. A real scholar of note. It sounds like this is even more true now than it was a decade ago, as she seems regularly to be bouncing all over the continent and across the pond to one or another invited presentation or exciting research project. What I've found as I've spent time with other patrologists and reflected on the nature of the work of remembering that we do is that there's good justification for this broad interest in her work. Professor Jensen is an engaging speaker, and her scholarship is interesting, informative, and sensible. Tastes in scholarship may differ, but as a patrologist, to say another's body of work is sensible is about the highest compliment I can conceive. In a world beset by the temptation to use scholarship to score cheap political points off ancient thinkers or serve ulterior agenda one way or another, Professor Jensen provides balanced and unassuming accounts of her subjects, and is thus able to find the humanity of early Christians and those they interacted with by taking both their arguments and their practices seriously and as much on their own terms as possible. She takes into account those things that ought to be taken into account with an impressive combination of artistic literacy, historical erudition, and theological sophistication, performing that most essential work of early Christian scholarship to try to rediscover and, where necessary, reconstruct the lives and habits of early Christians, simply so that they might be preserved and remembered for the insights that they contain. This promises to be an interesting and engaging set of lectures, and I'm excited to hear what Professor Jensen has in store to help us remember how Christian artists help tell the story of Christian scriptures and teachings.
I suppose I'll be happy if you all leave here with just a fraction of the excitement level that Greg has about these events. If that happens, then we shall consider this a great success. Excuse me. I also want to mention that there will be a period of time for discussion. Microphones are there to allow you to ask your burning questions, to share your observations. There should be lots to talk about. There always is when we are looking and working through the kinds of images we're about to work through this morning. So prepare for that. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jensen to the podium.
I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so flattered. And I really love that you called me sensible. I hope that I will make this sensible and not too erudite. I really welcome your questions and your thoughts, and I'm going to try to not make this really long so we have plenty of time for conversation. So let me just launch in. Christian theologians have often characterized other religions' cult images as pagan idols, and they regard them as evidence of ignorant, primitive, or superstitious worship of inanimate objects. Idol worship has even been posited as the defining feature of Greco-Roman polytheism. I just have this lovely image for you to look at. It's not ancient, but it's lovely. Most of these same theologians regard the adherence to the biblical prohibitions against making graven images, Exodus 24 and Deuteronomy 5, as a fundamental tenet in Jewish and Christian monotheism. So let's look at that for a minute. So this is just a very familiar text, I'm sure, to all of you, and on the right is an image from an early Christian sculptured tomb, a coffin, a sarcophagus, we call them, in which Moses is receiving the Ten Commandments from the hand of God. But I want to show you this. So what does the Bible actually say? How do we actually count the commandments? Now, this is something my students don't really know, and I think a lot of people don't know, that the commandments are not counted as such in the Bible. It doesn't say this is number 1 and this is number 2. So while we talk about a decalogue, we have to also remember that we don't know exactly which is 1 and which is 2. And if you can look up at these two, they look exactly alike, but they're very different. So if you notice, the one on the right, the second commandment is, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord God in vain." And on the left, it's, "Thou shalt not make for thyself a graven image," or something, okay? On the right is the Catholic Ten Commandments, and on the left is the Protestant Ten Commandments, more or less. So, and Lutherans get over here on the right as well. I think maybe the Anglicans do too. So this is an important point, so I'm going to come back to this. But what is the word? I'm going to come also to this one. What is the word in the Hebrew Scriptures that actually we're talking about when we say idol? Well, actually, the Hebrew word is betzal, which means carved. And thus it refers specifically to something carved, or a three-dimensional image. Hebrew has lots of other words that our English Bibles translate as idol. But none of these appears in the Decalogue. So here, I actually like the King James Version of translation here as graven image, as the most precise. Now, if we take the so-called first and so-called second commandments together as a single commandment in the Catholic fashion, "You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself a graven image, nor bow down and worship them," that could apply then only to carved images, and specifically to carved images of gods that might garner worship, specifically other people's gods. Truly, though, to be fair, and I'm not a Bible scholar, but the Bible has many texts that warn about idols, and you heard one of them already this morning, things that were fashioned out of stone or metal and look like they might speak or move, in which people put their trust. So there's a couple. There's part of that text you heard already, and then there's another one from the Psalms. And if you look carefully at the image on the right, it's an incipit from the book of Leviticus, but it's actually the scene of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, and what you notice on the bottom, the golden calf. So we have the golden calf story, in which somebody collected and made a graven image of something that was an animal that was worshipped and caused a lot of trouble, right? So we all know that story. Or we also have the famous story in the book of Daniel of the 3 Hebrew youths refusing to bow down and worship the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar set up. And then they got thrown into the fiery furnace because they refused to worship the statue. And of course, God rescues the 3. And I love this image of Nebuchadnezzar's statue in the center of the image. And then there's the horns and the timpan and the drums and all of the stuff that goes on around them. Now, so we have this problem of the 10 Commandments, but nevertheless, Christian theologians, both past and present, although fewer of those in the present, have interpreted the commandments against idolatry as not just against the golden calf or a statue set up by King Nebuchadnezzar, but as a denouncement of all pictorial art. And they also, surprisingly, argue that faithful Christians initially made no art at all. Now, for example, John Calvin, his censure of pictorial art in Book 1 of his Institutes of the Christian Religion is a case in point. According to him, true Christians would eschew all sacred images, and he insists that an imageless form of Christianity existed for the first 500 years. Calvin was certain that Christian visual art only appeared when church leadership had degenerated, godliness was lost, and the faithful slid headlong into pagan superstition. I'm not going to read this whole text. I don't want to take up too much time, but by now you've probably scanned it. I tried to put in bold some of the points I just made, but I love the word dreadful madness that has heretofore occupied the world, almost to the total destruction of godliness. Okay. Similarly, about 100 years later, Edward Gibbon's classic work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, reflects an attitude that still rings familiar, even though it was written more than 2 centuries ago. I'm going to read this one. Primitive Christians were possessed with an unconquerable repugnance to the use and abuse of images, and this aversion must be ascribed to their descent from the Jews and their enmity to the Greeks. The Mosaic Law severely proscribed all representations of the deity, and that precept was firmly established in the chosen people's principles and practices. The wit of Christian apologists was pointed against the foolish idolaters who bowed before the workmanship of their own hands, the brass and marble images which they had endowed with sense and motion, and should have stepped off their pedestals to adore, rather, the creative power of the artists. I'm kind of thinking about that hymn we sang. It's kind of wonderful. Before I continue, though, I think I would like to define some terms. So what are we talking about? Well, an icon, now many people, when I say icon, immediately think of a small panel painting of a saint. And that is an icon, and that's very technically an icon. But an icon is any image. It can be a mosaic, it can be a painting, it can be, the front cover of your college catalog, it can be almost anything. It's a visual representation. And then more narrowly, a sacred image. So for Christians, a sacred image would be an image of a saint or of Christ or the Virgin Mary. I come from Catholic world, so I think immediately of the Virgin Mary. An idol is different from an icon. An idol is an object of misplaced veneration. It could be a cult image of a god, but it might also be a possession, a person, or a focus of attention, of inappropriate attention. To be aniconic means not to have visual images, generally, or more specifically, not to have or make religious images, sacred images, cultic images. And then we get to iconophobic, which means you have a fear of images, believe that they're not just a bad idea, but they're actually harmful. And I would say that in early Christianity, a lot of Christian writers used to think that statues of other people's gods had where demons resided. And then there's people who are iconophilic. They love images, and they would include them in their religious devotion. And then there's iconoclastic, which means you go around destroying images, either yours or somebody else's. So here's a few examples. I lived in Nashville for a long time. I taught at the university, Vanderbilt University, and that's our Athena, a modern Athena in the Parthenon in Nashville, if anybody's been there. And then there's a kind of an image of Baal, a Canaanite god from many millennia before Christ. And then, of course, a classic Greek Orthodox icon of the Virgin Mary. And then here's another example of pagan, superstitious people worshiping a statue of the goddess Bess, who was part of the Isis cult in Rome, and this is in Rome. But I want to return to my question. Are Christians aniconic? Were they ever aniconic? Should they be aniconic or iconophobic, or simply anti-idol? That's where I'm going. Now, arguably, in the first 2 centuries, Christians might have been aniconic, but not necessarily iconophobic. Now, art historians have long recognized that surviving examples of identifiably Christian pictorial artworks are difficult to date anything earlier than the 2nd century or the beginning of the 3rd century. Before that time, pictorial images that could be regarded as explicitly Christian, biblical subjects or symbolic figures that have Christian associations or connotations, are either rare or non-existent or simply indistinguishable from those that belong to the wider cultural and religious context. But that means that material testimony to the faith of the first adherents to the Jesus movement is almost completely missing compared to the available documentary evidence from the first centuries. This is really striking. We don't have anything surviving. That doesn't mean there wasn't anything. We don't have anything surviving that we can date much more than about the year 200 of Christian pictorial art, or even material artifacts. However, contra Calvin, from no later than the early 3rd century, Christians unquestionably started to acquire visual images for their worship spaces, their homes, and their burial chambers. We think, for instance, of the great catacombs in Rome. Or, this is a famous church in Syria that was decorated, and we date it around 250. It's called, this church is doesn't exist anymore, but it's in the Yale, well, for a while in the Yale Art Gallery. It's a baptistry in a town called Dura Europos in Syria. That we have no definitively Christian pictorial art from the first 2 centuries could simply be due to the vagaries of historical preservation. However, the almost total lack of any of this evidence does suggest that Christians maybe made no distinguishing artworks, but that doesn't mean, though, that they wouldn't have selectively adapted objects belonging to their pagan neighbors. Now, one of the great examples of this is the Good Shepherd. When Christians made a Good Shepherd, they based it on the image of Hermes carrying a sheep over his shoulders, and that's another part of the story. So we know that there was a way of reading. In the way that they still spoke Latin and Greek, they used the visual vocabulary of their neighbors. But what we do have, we don't have any art, but what we do have is a lot of critique of pagan cult images and of idolatry, and even of attempting to make an image of God, which is not the same as a critique of visual art, of which we have almost no instances. We have no Christian from the first 450 years almost makes any critique of visual art as such. So this is my question. And here, I guess this would be a really good example of somebody who's critiquing idolatry, and this is Justin Martyr, writing in about 160 AD. So my question is, why? Did the relatively late emergence of Christian art have anything at all to do with the biblical prohibition of graven images? Or if we imagine that 1st and 2nd century Christians were faithful to biblical injunctions against the making of graven images, did they extend that to include any kind of pictorial art, or just to ones that might depict a deity that would have been venerated? Now, I'm going to take a little aside for a moment. Romans made pictures of their gods, but not all of those images of their gods were subject to sacrifices and prayers. Sometimes they were just decorative. So we have to distinguish between cult images and just artwork in general. Now, this is my problem, my art historical problem. Eminent art historians of the past, some of my great mentors and some of my intellectual mentors, such as Theodor Klauser and Ernst Kitzinger in the 1950s, and André Grabar and Kurt Weitzman in the 1960s, contended that early Christianity, like Judaism, was essentially aniconic and even iconophobic. Therefore, they took it for granted that Christians consciously avoided making any kind of visual art. As evidence, they cited the writings of the 2nd and 3rd century Christian apologists like Justin Martyr or Tertullian of Carthage, who condemned Roman idol veneration. However, these art historians failed to notice that such documents never condemn pictorial art as such, much less ever mention any Christian examples. Moreover, in their critiques of pagan idolatry, these early apologists hardly ever even mention the biblical commandments. There's only 3 examples I have found, and they're kind of buried. Yet, André Grabar, for example, in his influential and still much used volume, Early Christian Art, states that the Christian paintings of this early period have a very special interest for the light they throw on the religious value assigned to images, for it must not be forgotten that they are the earliest figurations of a religion that had originally dispensed with any iconography and, failing to divine the enormous importance that the religious image was later to assume, had begun by ruling it out entirely. Now, Grabar is actually pro-image, so you can take that. But this one, also from a Byzantine art historian who really loves Byzantine artwork, says, in the entire history of European art, it's difficult to name any one fact more momentous than the admission of graven images by the Christian church. Had Christianity persisted in the categorical rejection of images, and indeed of all art, which it proclaimed during the first 2 centuries, the mainstream of the Greco-Roman tradition would have been blocked, driven underground, or at best diverted into side channels of purely secular or decorative work. Okay, so here's a guy who really likes art, but is still contending that Christianity was a momentous change. Many of these historians who take it for granted that early Christianity was an imageless religion also theorize, like Edward Gibbon, that Christianity became increasingly decadent or Hellenized in the 3rd and 4th centuries as the community expanded and church leaders felt they had to accommodate the less devout members of their flock. In other words, they propose that the emergence of Christian images at the beginning of the 3rd century was merely a pragmatic, ecclesiastical response to the demands and needs of half-hearted and backsliding converts to the faith who found an aniconic or imageless religion difficult to accept. These indulged converts ostensibly failed to abandon their idolatrous past, misunderstood anti-material, the spiritual dimensions of the faith, and did not realize that the Christian God's invisibility and transcendence precluded any cult images of any deity. We can think about Jesus, but that's maybe for the question and answer period here. Some of these scholars further characterize these producers or consumers of art as coming from society's marginalized classes, the uneducated poor, who were moved or captivated by visual images and symbols because they could not read or comprehend the more abstract truths of Christian theology, or perhaps just didn't agree with them. And this, I say, generally corresponds to the famous dictum of Gregory the Great that art is the Bible of the unlettered, which I get told all the time in my work. And I always go, that means that art is only for children or the illiterate. No. Okay. Simplistically, this is sometimes also posited as a split between conservative clerics and a liberal, new type of laity. James Breckenridge in 1978 said this: "We suggest that the expansion of Christian art in the later 3rd century was not the result of a change in the attitude of the church toward religious images, but of the enfeeblement of its ability to enforce its rules, an unchanged official position which was in reality impossible to maintain in the face of popular interest in the portrayal of objects of worship, an interest all the stronger in view of the mountainous wave of new converts from idolatrous paganism following the Edict of Toleration, which is kind of jumping ahead to the 4th century, but we'll leave that alone. More recently, the art historian Beat Brink in 2010 chalked all this up to the ingrained habits of the privileged classes, not the lower classes, but now we're talking about the privileged classes, and proposes that in their desire to recruit more members, church authorities even suppressed problematic references to the biblical prohibition. And I just have to read this to you. He says, "The second commandment prohibits any kind of religious image without exception. The church, however, was not able to comply with a unité de doctrine. In the city of Rome, it would have been simply impossible to issue such a prohibition because images there were something absolutely normal for the newly Christianized upper-class believers. The second commandment was only discussed orally. That is why there are no texts on the matter, and if they ever existed, the church probably let them disappear." Now, Brank's argument from silence is obviously problematic. No one knows from this distance what was discussed only orally or suppressed. What is interesting is that he misses an obvious answer for why the second commandment is missing from the record. It may simply be that it just was never an issue. Nevertheless, the conviction that most 1st and 2nd century Christians eschewed pictorial art because they were consciously obedient to the prohibitions of the Decalogue, or because they regarded their new religion as superior in its emphasis on the spiritual or the material, continues into the present day. And I could go on, but I'm not going to keep boring you with those. The supposed Aniconism, or even iconophobia, of 1st and 2nd century Christians was challenged by other historians, beginning with the work of Mary Charles Murray in the 1970s, and subsequently by Paul Corby Murray in the 1990s. Both scholars effectively critiqued the prevailing view of Christians as monolithically hostile to images. Charles Murray also insisted that historians' presumptions about supposed Jewish aniconism in the early Christian era were also clearly challenged by contemporary archaeological evidence of Jewish pictorial art. So perhaps ancient Jews were also not as aniconic as everybody thought. And this is the Dura Europa synagogue from about 250 and very beautifully painted with narrative scenes and figurative art. And we have plenty of, and continuing to be discovered, mosaic panels in Jewish synagogues. So, as I've already mentioned, around the same time as many of these apologists were railing against pagan idols, ordinary Christians began making pictorial art for their tombs and their homes and their churches and their personal objects. And some of these depicted simple figures like fish and anchors and boats, and others by scenes from the Old Testament. Adam and Eve, Noah, Jonah, Moses, here's some more. And fairly soon, also New Testament images of Jesus' baptism, Jesus raising the dead, healing the sick, multiplying loaves, and changing water to wine. And this is a few more just quick images. You can see these things emerging in the 3rd century. Beautiful, sometimes not so beautiful, sometimes I sort of said cartoonish, sometimes they look a little sketchy, but this is just a very rich relief carving on the front of somebody's coffin. And of course, as Professor Webb has said, I've spent a lot of my time working on this project, so I believe in this work. But here's the point, and this is my wrap-up. Narrative images like these, as you've just seen, are not idols. They are not likely to prompt any prayers. They may be edifying or inspiring, but they're not cult images. To reiterate, early Christians never actually objected to pictorial art as such. Surviving literary evidence clearly shows, however, that their spokespersons were extremely hostile to the veneration of pagan cult images. because they were the wrong gods. Those were the dangerous images they condemned. Thus, early Christian opposition to pictorial art was aimed at a specific kind of image, depictions of divine beings, and in particular, representations of the Greco-Roman deities. Whoops, I didn't give you that one. Okay. Christian teachers did not object to other types of pictorial art. They did not find harm in the decorative pictorial murals or pavements, even those of their pagan neighbors. In fact, they did not even object to depictions on walls and floors that displayed scenes from Greco-Roman myths. Why? Because these were not images that would have prompted sacrifices or prayers. And in fact, sometimes those Greco-Roman myths were even found in Christian sites as kind of testifying to the antiquity of Christian belief. And from no later than the 3rd century onwards, they apparently made no complaint about Christian pictorial images either. The visual art that Christians produced from the 3rd through the mid-4th century didn't prompt worship. Who would venerate a painting of a biblical scene? Now, in fact, no Christian criticism of Christian sacred images commenced until around the beginning of the 5th century, when they began to make their own sacred images depicting holy persons as well as Christ. Anti-image invectives arose around then and got especially heated, of course, during the iconoclastic controversies of the 8th and 9th and 16th centuries. But that's another story. We don't have time for that today. But what Christians initially commissioned and used were nearly always narrative images drawn from biblical stories. They're never portraits, and moreover, they're almost always two-dimensional, relief carvings, and not statues in the round. And there's a reason for that, because those would have looked most like pagan god statues. The 3rd century emergence of a definitive Christian iconography, then, shows that Christians, perhaps feeling a little more socially and politically secure, and also including enough wealthy members to afford them, sought to have pictorial artworks to adorn their tombs and their homes and their early worship spaces. Evidently, their leaders and their teachers did not object, or at least we don't have any records of their objections. So in conclusion, there's simply no reason to judge the emergence of definitively Christian art objects as evidence that Christians succumbed to pagan practices. And if early Christians can be described as aniconic, it is not because they produced no images, but because the images they likely produced were initially not that different from the pagan cult images they derided. Paying attention to the kinds of pictorial art, then, we discuss is crucially important for understanding the nature and function of earliest Christian iconography period, which, if I said, consists mainly of pictorial biblical figures and renderings of stories. No one objected to these. No priest, no bishop, no theologian even mentions them. They just emerged naturally and clearly and successfully and evidently caused no anxiety at the time. To equate all pictorial art with idolatry, then, is simply to mistake the various ways art functions. Earliest Christian art had its distinctive purposes and resonated with much of the theology and biblical commentary and ritual practices of the community. It was not some aberrant invention that dragged the faithful down into the edge of perdition. In the final analysis, the concern about idolatry is not about art or what it depicts. It is about how the art is regarded, whether it is misunderstood and abused. If you think a statue really is a god and worship it, that's idolatry. This, I contend, was obvious to early Christians. It was also obvious to pagans. The art is not the problem. It's the behaviors that are idolatrous. The worship of wealth or status or possessions or pop stars can also be idolatrous. These are the harmful idols, and not two-dimensional paintings of biblical characters that Christians put on their catacombs and church walls. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. I think we are The stage has been set. We can look forward to how this gets developed in the next 2 lectures, but let's leave that for now and spend some time talking about this discussion. Now is your time to ask questions, to make observations, to get into the discussion. We have mics in each aisle. Please come up, introduce yourself, and put your comments to Dr. Jensen. Please. I'll just step aside now.
I can get us started. I might have a couple, but let's start with one. Adoption of non-cultic pagan art by Christians. I wonder if you could expand on this a bit. I have in mind sort of some of the later Byzantine iconographic use of like Plato and Socrates kind of in the narthex, like being like Plato and Socrates being painted in the narthex of a Byzantine church. There's that kind of thing. But I think you're talking about something different, like the use of non-cultic images by Christians.
Right. One of the things that we talk about a lot is, for instance, Jesus is often depicted, well, not often, but he can be depicted in early Christian iconography as riding in a chariot driven by 4 white horses up into the sky. And that's exactly how Romans would have depicted the god of the sun, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. And we have Christian texts earlier, but around the same time, in which they compare Jesus to this and say, yes, he's the rising sun. Think of John 1, he's the bringer of the light into the world. And so we use the kind of metaphorical imagery and language that's familiar. If you're trying to convert people to your religion, you might have to use something that they will understand. And so there's a way in which these are transferred. Orpheus is another example. We see a certain amount of Orpheus in Christian contexts. Of course, Orpheus is a kind of pagan hero god who tamed wild animals with his song, with his lyre, and rescued or tried to rescue his wife from the underworld. And so there's a kind of story in the same way that we might think about Narnia, or something that we might use, where there's a kind of myth story that we can interpret through a Christian lens. And that's what I mean, that we see this happening in early Christianity not because they don't know the difference, not because they're not really wholeheartedly Christian, and I have arguments with my colleagues about this because we're all into now, nobody has an identity. I think we have identities. But I think what we do is we use the current language, vocabulary, and imagery of our cultures to tell our stories. And that sometimes means we draw upon figures from Dante. Virgil will show up, And so I think there's a kind of embrace of the antiquity and Christianizing it. So the best example, the most commonly cited example, is the fact that every time we see the Good Shepherd figure, which is probably the most popular figure in early Christianity, it's a figure of a man. It's not Jesus. It's actually the metaphorical Good Shepherd. It's a way of showing who Jesus was. But it's a shepherd with a sheep over his shoulders. He's got a short tunic, and he's usually got a crook sometimes, and he's got sheep at his feet. And that's exactly what Hermes looks like in much of the early Roman art, and because Hermes was the person who led the dead safely into the underworld and brought messages back. And we get the word hermeneutics from that. So it's a way of thinking your religion into your culture.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up? Do you ever see pagan art as pagan art in Christian setting, or is it only ever sort of converted to a use of idiom to depict something Christian?
That's a really great question. I don't know if I have a really perfect answer to that. In some places, we have seen a kind of combination, juxtaposition of pagan types with Christian types, and sometimes we think, well, maybe that's just simply like Hercules shows up sometimes, and maybe it's a family that was some Christians and some non-Christians in the family, so they're kind of having it both ways. There's also there's a couple of good stories, one from Irenaeus in the 2nd century and one from much later in the 6th, of artists making images of Jesus to look like Jupiter. So that one could actually sort of have it both ways. And of course, I'm not going to tell you this because this is something I work on a lot with my students. Jesus does not have a beard until about the beginning of the 5th century. He just suddenly grows a beard, and after that, Jesus never doesn't have a beard. But I associate this to a Christological argument in which, you know this well, in which Jesus suddenly has to be as mature and old as the Father God. So we give him a beard. But he also then, how are you going to make an image? You're an artist. Think about this for a minute. How are you going to make an image of Jesus? Well, we don't know what he looked like, right? The Bible doesn't tell us what he looked like. So what's he going to look like? Well, he's a savior. he does important miracles. Maybe he looks like Dionysus or Apollo. I mean, that will at least communicate the type of a savior. And that's just using vocabulary, I think. We don't make him naked, which is the interesting part, actually. Jesus is almost never naked, until we get to Michelangelo, and then it's all.
Hi, I'm Paul Dick. I teach English literature here, and I work in 16th and 17th century. So, and in that kind of Protestant world, I'm wondering if I'm just going to embarrass myself here in front of my students, who I've been encouraging them to ask clear questions, and then, here it is. But I just love all this stuff. I love what you're doing here. And I'm interested in how, though, like, you start with Calvin, and I'm tempted to sort of frame this as a defense of Calvin, just for fun. But so Calvin's saying, oh yeah, in the first 500 years, no images in the churches, and then you're saying, well, but these are non-cultic images, and that we have to get into the development of the cultic image later. But of course, it's the cultic image that Calvin's worrying about, and in the sense that at least in early 17th century England, people aren't worried about images in general. They're worried about cultic images especially. So there you've got lots of biblical depictions outside of churches, but also in stained glass. You've got this kind of complicated situation. I guess my question is, how much can we separate the history, right? Like, the question of the history of the first centuries of Christianity seems always, at least when Calvin's bringing it up, it's like always got an immediate kind of cultic question to it. And so, are we always kind of asking the question out of our immediate situation, I suppose? Is that an interesting question?
Well, you're right, except that Calvin is absolutely opposed to it. I mean, and the question, what is a cultic image, is kind of a problematic one too, I suppose. He sort of thinks that biblical imagery is sort of a concession, right? It's not really something he actually approved of, but it was okay, sort of like, if you had, you could have an illustrated Bible, maybe, because it would teach people the stories if they didn't have any other way to learn them. And Luther, of course, is a little bit more open to that. I mean, so he gets in a big fight, as we know, with Karlstadt about iconoclasm. And so it's all over the map. And sometimes it's more of a social reform, if you think about Zurich and things that are happening up in Switzerland, when people were destroying images, Protestant movement to destroy images, and including candlesticks and things that didn't have pictures at all. But on organs and stained glass and all that. I think what's interesting, maybe in terms of thinking about your question, I'm maybe wandering off a little, is and I mentioned it, and it'll come up again in the next lecture as this famous dictum of Gregory the Great that's repeated through the Middle Ages, and even Calvin refers to it in the Institutes, that the Bible, images are, and it's often given as a defense of art, Boy, we don't want to destroy those pictures. They're really good for the illiterate. Well, that's kind of an insult, really. I mean, I always use the example of when you get to like third grade and they give you chapter books and they take away picture books and they say, now you're grown up, you don't need those pictures anymore, you just need words. And I'm thinking, oh, as an art historian and as an artist in my life, and I've worked as an illustrator, it kind of breaks my heart when I hear this, because I think it's sort of a denigration, or at least a put down of what art is for. And that's kind of the subject of the next lecture, so I don't want to get into it, but cultic images, let me just I won't be talking about this, I'll just put it out there, that this might be, as you think about icons and we think about devotional images, they're not narrative images. This is an important thing. What happens at the end of the 4th century and into the 5th is that Christianity shifts, not completely, but does a kind of a 160 into portrait-type images. So suddenly you see Jesus in the apse of the church surrounded by saints, and you're not going to see anymore Noah or Jonah. And so it's an interesting shift. And that's the subject of the book that just came out.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ron Dewick. I'm not a scholar, member of the Charleswood Mennonite Church. My question sort of is tied a little bit to what you just explained, but I see the New Testament as being very full of imagery, in many of the books at least. And the idea of a written image, a mental concept, and art, I mean, the three seem to go together. And with all that written imagery, you would think that there would be a lot of physical icons on which those would be based. Any comment on that?
I don't really. I think it's it's a wonderful question, because especially the Gospel of John is filled with imagery. I am the vine and you are the branches, or whatever we want to think about. And we do think that pretty soon stuff like images of rich vines bearing grapes are probably, a pagan would have looked at that and said, oh, that's a lovely image of a garden. And a Christian might look at it and say, oh, there's Jesus, the big grape. But anyway, and I think that's true with many early images like fish and other kinds of things, that we see these early symbol images. Christian art kind of develops first from symbols like fish and grapes and doves and peacocks into biblical images, and only much later into portraits. Something I was going to say about your question, though, and I've forgotten, my mind just stopped. Maybe it'll come back to me. But I think you're right in terms of the Good Shepherd being one of the most important early images, as I said, adapted from a way that Hermes was depicted. But still, all over, talk about imagery from the New Testament. Yeah, that'd be one of the ones that would see it first.
On the question of correlating art and texts, and especially official texts, I want to go back just a little further in time also. I'm interested in actually why it is that the first and second of the Decalogue actually belong together, especially when they're correlated with actual art and cultic object representations from the time period of the Israelite monarchy. And what's interesting is that when Yahweh gets represented, he's correlated with Asherah, and in fact Asherah is the more representative figure in that time period, but she does have an afterlife in text as the tree of life, but in the Jewish tradition without artistic representation to that extent. But I'm just wondering if, in other words, the production of the official text has a complex correlation with actual practices at the time period, which I think is kind of what you're driving at in regard to who's privileged or not, and so forth. Any thoughts on that kind of background?
I'm afraid of wading into the sort of some of those questions about Israelite monarchies, and sometimes that and I'm not a biblical scholar, and I know some of this is now being debated. The various source traditions, JEDP, we used to say when I was in seminary, but that I think we could look at some people think that the anti-idolatry texts are coming from the Deuteronomic reform. And so they have a different strain. And so we might have to look at the biblical texts a lot more carefully in terms of, where they're coming from in terms of historical strains and different kinds of texts coming in. One of the things that people point to all the time is that we do have in the building of the tabernacle and then later the first temple, there's lots of iconography. I mean, there's the cherubim and there's the oxen and there's all these things. So, it's much more. It's a very complicated question, and there's a lot of really good books out by Jewish art historians now and biblical scholars on how much cultic imagery there was and what the attitudes were. And it's all over the place. There's a lot more evidence for images of God than we ever thought, and it wasn't always prohibited. Yeah.
Dietrich Bartel. I teach in the area of music and dabble in art. You ended the presentation with sort of this challenge of it's how we deal with the art that is the problem, and I'm wondering if you could just expand a bit on sort of the difference between venerating and worship, and idol and icon, or maybe that's something that will be coming up. I'm not sure.
No, I might not be coming back to it, so let me do that. So one of the things that we talk about veneration as different from worship, and we have these different words that the Greeks will really clarify for us. What is bowing down to and worshiping and what is veneration, and that's a difference, right? You don't actually think that the icon, the paint and the wood is actually a god or a saint or Jesus or Mary. It is a mode of access for prayer, so that the prayer is directed to the one that is being depicted, not the object as such. And that's a really important distinction. And that's not a distinction that was thought up by Christians. It was actually already said to Christians by pagans, saying, we don't think those statues are gods. We're not that stupid. We offer our prayers to the image, so already that's a kind of a funny way. I think sometimes when early Christian apologists accuse people of worshiping statues, they're actually being a little disingenuous. They knew perfectly well they weren't worshiping statues as such. So that might be the question of what is it that we actually think we're doing, and what do we think these things are? And how much value do we put in them as such, as themselves? As opposed to instruments by which we then encounter the sacred, and we have a moment where prayer is directed. And one of the things that we've learned, as psychologists have learned, is that faces are the things that we actually connect to. That's the first thing a child looks at, is the mother's face. And so that's a really big part of this. But when I was thinking about, as you were talking about, I got into trouble in the book when I just did it because I used the word adore, adoration. And one of my editors was saying, "You can't say that. That's dangerous. They don't adore these things." I'm going, in the Catholic tradition, when the cross comes up on Good Friday, the deacon says, "Behold, behold, the wood of the cross," and the congregation says, "Oh, come, let us adore it." So we don't mean we're actually worshiping the wood, but it's a really interesting question and distinction, and it's an important one to make that distinction.
Lois Siemens. I'm a pastor at a seniors residence in Saskatchewan. And what I noticed during COVID is people would worship in their homes, in their apartments or suites. And then we started having public worship again. And what they needed in their homes in terms of image and what we need in public worship is different. Mm-hmm. I put up a banner, a candle, a cross, Bible. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering about these early Christians in first and second centuries, if the place they worshiped influenced what they needed for image.
Mm-hmm. Well, we don't know a lot about the places in which they worshipped. I'm convinced in my own heart that they had places. We have some evidence that they got torn down, so we know that they had them. What they look like is harder to come up with. We assume they started working in fairly modest domestic spaces, and that things were, people sat around tables. But that pretty soon the congregation gets too big and they need to convert spaces into larger spaces. There are folks that think there was very likely decoration of those spaces, and we have one example, so we could say, yeah, we think that they wouldn't have been the only one. But when time came and people needed to make bigger spaces like we do, we tear down old things and build new things, and so we don't have the old anymore. There's very little that I have to go on about what they look like, but I do have a little bit. I know that they used tablecloths. I know they used candles. And I have some good reason to think that there was some images at times in them. We have, in around 300, we have a council that asked people not to worship the images on the walls, which assumes that they had them. So, we kind of worked with that, yeah. And I think that one of the things is to think about the environment of worship. I love what you're saying, you're going to this idea, is that it's what surrounds us. It's our surroundings. And think about people who never ever left home, always went to the same place from birth to death. That shapes their theology. What they see is going to shape the way they think about God and what they're doing and what the worship is. That I have big fights with my conservative architecture friends in the Department of Architecture at Notre Dame who think that all architecture should be Renaissance. I'm going, wait, that wouldn't work in Japan, So, yeah, I think we need to think how important that question is. What is it that we see? It's like music, it's the same thing. We think how important music is to us in worship, especially as I can tell you from here. So is our environment. Whatever that is. And I'm pretty open-minded with what that should be.
Hello, I'm Kyla, a fourth-year political studies student. And I don't know much about paganism or early Christianity, so forgive me if this is out of bounds maybe, but I've been thinking a lot about iconography in the sense of political cartoons I just took a class on, and how art often is a space of creative imagination and also of ways of being that aren't yet realized. And thinking of kind of the sharing of metaphor, I'm kind of curious how you see that, like obviously you said how maybe the use of pagan metaphor for the Christians was a way of convincing others of their faith, but I'm kind of interested to see how maybe that was an acknowledgement of multiplicities of truth and dynamic realities and things like that, so I'm just interested.
I think I'm catching the drift of this question. I think we could, I'm looking at this icon on the wall, as a matter of fact, and thinking about, for example, now this probably isn't going to be an answer to your question, but let me just throw it out there anyway. One of the things that I get asked about a lot is the image of white Jesus, right? So the European Jesus that we have in all those big European paintings. Or I had the faculty at Sewanee University of the South asking me how to replace their crucifix because they decided it was a Eurocentric crucifix and it no longer worked for their student body. So how do we expand and include and even reach out beyond maybe our usual boundaries to bring in new ideas, new challenging ideas, to work our imaginations, to accept images that might seem at first different to us, out of a different culture altogether. And maybe my examples of using the early pagan images helps, because something like a halo, now that wasn't originally a Christian thing at all. That's what the emperor got, and then maybe some Buddhist figures. So Christians adopted that to say, okay, this person has a glow. How do we identify the saint in the picture? Well, it's got a halo, right? But that wasn't initially a Christian idea at all. That came from another tradition altogether. And I think that's the kind of thing where we can expand and we can imagine and we can say, how do we do a visual representation of something? I think if you're at the next lecture, you're going to see something that might kind of give some answers to that. I hope so.
My name is Anne, and I'm a fifth-year music student, but I'm also an Orthodox Christian, so it's really interesting to me what you're talking about here. One of the things that was a little bit new to me was the idea that Christian art before the 5th century was, you were saying, was not so much used for worship, like it wasn't a cult image, so to speak, and then afterwards it began to shift more into the portraits that would be used in worship that are familiar to, like, worshipped in my tradition today anyway. Is there any more you can say about that, or that shift, or how that occurred and why? And I'm just confused.
Oh, it's a big question. I wrote a whole book about this, and I probably shouldn't bore you too much. But one of the interesting things is, well, first of all, something that I might not say, and it's really a surprise to most people, there is no crucifixion image that exists before the 5th century. So what we think like was the major Christian image, the crucifix, we don't have that really until around 420, and then not really until the 6th century, and then Jesus isn't dead on this cross until really the 9th century in the West. So that's a big thing. But so what happens around the middle of the 4th century, a really amazing thing happens within Christian practice, and it's what historians have now started to call the material turn. And what it means is that things like relics and pilgrimage, and I would add to this icons, which makes my art history friends, some of them, very upset, happen around the same time. And I'm not quite sure all the reasons yet, I think, why this happened. I wrote a whole book trying to figure out the answer, and I had to take the deep, horrible secret is I don't have an answer. I didn't answer the question I set out to ask. But all of a sudden, it's like Christians, and maybe this comes to your question a little bit, wanted something tangible. So they began to go to tombs, nobody went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land until about 315, shortly after Constantine began building the site at Jerusalem. There wasn't anything like that. And so that sacred places and making bodily pilgrimages to those places and picking up dirt from those places and bringing back water from those places and then collecting the remains of a saint and holding on to the tears of the Madonna or whatever, all of this begins to happen around the same time, and it's the same time that we see the shift from mostly narrative images into mostly portrait images. And we see that people are, in fact, beginning to venerate portrait images, to offer prayers in ways that they didn't before, probably. And that's a whole movement of maybe beginning. The earliest thing we can say about relic veneration is around 360, so it's pretty late. In my world, late. In your world, probably really, really early, but so it's an important change.